The wind at Malibu Beach had a cruel way of remembering. It curled against my skin, crisp and knowing, like it held receipts of every argument, every silent night, every bruise I hid beneath bronzer. My ex-husband's laughter rang out not far from where I sat, his hand snug on the waist of the secretary I once trained. She giggled like I had once done, before I understood that laughter in our marriage was often a prelude to pain. I sipped my lukewarm coffee and didn't flinch when his eyes caught mine across the sand. Before I continue narrating the story of Evelyn, please consider giving this video a like, share it, and subscribe to the channel. We had been divorced only 2 months when he decided to make a show of things here. Malibu had always been my retreat, not his. He hated sand in his loafers, the stickiness of sunscreen, the way saltwater tangled his perfect hair. But now he paraded his new toy here like a banner, her bikini bright, his hands louder than his voice. She was young, she was eager, and above all, she was temporary. I had been all three once. I remembered the first time I met her. Her name was Kaya, and she wore nude lipstick that smeared when she bit her pen. She shadowed me for 6 weeks, always wide-eyed, always too quick to agree. "You're who I want to be," she had whispered once in the elevator, like flattery might buy her a shortcut. I should have known then. Mimicry is often the first red flag of betrayal. The divorce wasn't dramatic. It was clinical. He filed, I signed, we split assets like dry toast between us. My lawyer said I walked away with the better half. The house, the car, the art. But he walked away with my years, my sleep, my identity ground down to a nub by every gaslit conversation. Some nights I stared at the ceiling fan and wondered if I had ever really loved him or just feared being alone. He used to say I was too much, too intense, too clever, too stubborn for peace. But now he was with someone who smiled at every suggestion, who nodded even when he made mistakes, who didn't argue facts but played dumb to soothe his ego. I watched them kiss on the beach towel like they were auditioning for a tabloid. It was so staged, it could have been choreographed. My fingers tightened around my coffee cup, but I didn't look away. I had chosen this spot on purpose. It was where his father once brought us for his birthday. The same year he named me in the will. His father, Randolph Eastwood, hadn't liked me at first. He thought I was too grounded, too unimpressed by their wealth. But after 5 dinners and 1 heartfelt conversation about mutual stocks, he'd called me the smartest Eastwood yet, even though I never took his last name. He said I reminded him of his late wife, and I took that as the only compliment I ever needed from a man like him. Randolph passed 3 weeks after our divorce papers were finalized. Heart attack in his sleep, the way all control freaks seem to go, quietly, without asking permission. I hadn't spoken to him in months, but his lawyer called me anyway. "You need to be at the reading," she'd said. "Trust me." I did, though I didn't know why. Today wasn't about Kaya, and it wasn't about Garrett. Not really. It was about waiting. Because in 4 hours, I'd be walking into his father's estate in Brentwood, where the will would be read and the aftermath of old secrets would begin to bloom like blood through gauze. He had no idea I'd been invited. I'd let him keep flaunting until then. He glanced at me again, this time with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he'd won. His ego was always made of sugar glass, pretty from afar, fragile in heat. Kaya leaned into him, whispering something. He laughed too loud, too deliberately. I wondered if he even liked her or just liked the way she made me look humiliated. I wasn't humiliated. I was documenting. Every gesture, every glance, every smug little smile was being logged in my mind like a case study. He thought I was here by accident, maybe clinging to places that reminded me of him. The truth was, I had arrived first and waited for him to notice. The cafe I sat at used to be our spot, a small thatched roof shack with overpriced smoothies and indifferent waitstaff. We had once fought here over his refusal to attend therapy. He said therapy was for the weak, and I told him that unchecked rage was a weakness in disguise. That was the day I stopped calling him love and started calling him by his name. It's strange how small places can cradle such large endings. A seagull screamed above us, as if mocking the illusion of paradise. Malibu was full of ghosts. Not the haunting kind, but the emotional ones. Moments frozen in time, eager to be replayed like a favorite trauma. Garrett kissed Kaya's temple and looked over again, waiting for me to crack. I smiled instead, a slow, eerie thing that made him blink. He didn't expect that. He expected me to cry, to leave, to storm off in vintage heartbreak. But I had already mourned him, and mourning twice would be inefficient. I stood slowly, brushed the crumbs off my jeans, and walked down the beach. Not toward him. Past him like he was a pedestrian accident I couldn't be late for. Kaya turned to look at me and faltered. She must have remembered who I was. The woman who used to train her, who used to sign her paychecks, who used to answer every question she had about upward mobility. Now, I was a ghost walking on sand, softer than anger, sharper than revenge. She shrank into herself, unsure whether to smile or ignore me. I walked right by, and the wind kept my secret. When I reached the end of the cove, I took out my phone and checked the time. 3 hours and 52 minutes to go. The will reading would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. Garrett had always assumed he'd inherit the business, the properties, the legacy, but he didn't know about the codicil Randolph had added in March. He didn't know that I had witnessed it, that I had signed it, that the lawyers had insisted on a confidentiality clause so intense it came with its own NDA. Randolph hadn't trusted Garrett with the future. He'd trusted me, and in less than 4 hours, that trust would detonate his son's empire. The drive to Brentwood felt shorter than I remembered. My playlist hummed with low violins and jazz piano, a sound I used to associate with dinner parties and now with pre-war calm. I didn't think of Garrett or Kaya once. I thought only of how Randolph's house would smell like cedar and lemon oil. The winding roads led up to the estate like veins into a fortress. When the gate opened for me, the guard gave a small nod. He remembered me, of course. The gravel crunched beneath my tires with a sound that felt deliberate. I parked beneath the same olive tree where Garrett used to lean during smoke breaks, before I asked him to quit for the 3rd time. I didn't linger. I stepped out in black slacks, a navy blouse, and the same gold watch Randolph once complimented at Thanksgiving. The air here was cooler than the beach, wrapped in the kind of wealth that air-conditioned its own silence. Inside, the house was hushed but tense. A legal assistant I didn't recognize offered me a water bottle, which I declined. I was already hydrated, focused, and alert. The den had been converted into a conference room. Long mahogany table, glass pitchers of water, manila folders stacked in a cruelly neat pyramid. I took my seat at the far end, alone for now. People began to arrive in slow, staggered waves. Garrett wasn't among the first. His mother came in with her pearls clutched like rosary beads and nodded at me with a politeness dipped in vinegar. A cousin I barely remembered took the seat across from me, eyes wide with curiosity but lips sealed by etiquette. The lawyer, Mary Ann Hess, walked in last with a silver laptop and calm eyes. "Thank you for being here," she began, always the professional. She adjusted her glasses and gave the room a moment to still. Randolph Eastwood left behind a will that has been recently amended by a legal codicil dated March 3rd of this year. My stomach tightened the way it had when I witnessed him sign it. Due to confidentiality and the nature of the contents, each of you will receive your instructions one at a time. Murmurs stirred but didn't erupt. This was still Randolph's court, even in death. One by one, people were summoned into the adjacent study and returned, looking either confused or quietly satisfied. Garrett arrived 15 minutes late, dressed like he had rushed from an influencer shoot. White linen shirt, top 3 buttons undone, hair tousled for effect. Kaya was with him, inexplicably, clinging to his arm like it was her name on the deed. No one told her to leave. He saw me and smirked like the beach was still beneath us. I didn't return it. My folder sat unopened in front of me, waiting. I noticed Mary Ann's gaze linger on Kaya, but she said nothing. Garrett muttered something about being ready to collect what's his, and I nearly laughed out loud. His name was finally called. He stood, adjusted his collar, and strode into the study like a prince about to inherit a kingdom. Kaya made a move to follow, but Mary Ann raised a finger and shook her head, firm and professional. The door shut behind him, and the room exhaled collectively. His mother dabbed at her forehead with a lace kerchief, pretending it was just the heat. 10 minutes passed, then 20. People began to glance toward the door. When it finally opened, Garrett's face looked like stone cracked in the middle. He didn't say anything, not even to Kaya, just walked past her and out of the house without a word. My name was called next. I walked into the study with my pulse steady and my eyes dry. Marianne waited by the fireplace, the codicil already on the desk. "Please sit," she said, softer than she'd spoken to anyone else. Randolph was clear about everything. I sat down, and she began to read. The estate, the primary property in Brentwood, along with 2 rentals in Calabasas, was now mine. The foundation he'd started for inner-city youth, also mine to manage and expand if I chose. The shares in Eastwood Technologies, divided evenly between me and his most trusted VP, not Garrett. His reasoning, as written in his own cursive, was simple. She is the only one I trust to think long-term. I didn't cry, though my throat ached with something heavy. I signed where I needed to, accepted the folder, and walked back into the den. Kaya looked up expectantly, but I didn't give her the satisfaction of a glance. Garrett was gone, his car no longer visible from the window. The empire he expected had been reassigned, and he hadn't seen it coming. Back in my own car, I exhaled for the first time in hours. It wasn't joy I felt. It was something colder, steadier, like justice marinated in time. I didn't want his father's money, but I respected the clarity of the gesture. Randolph hadn't chosen me out of affection. He'd chosen me out of logic. And that was a kind of love, too. My phone buzzed, and for a moment I thought it might be Garrett. It wasn't. It was a message from Randolph's lawyer. "Please don't forget the meeting with the foundation board next Friday. He spoke very highly of your ideas." I smiled, just barely. Malibu felt 1,000 miles away now. The ocean couldn't wash this clean. I stopped for dinner at a quiet place near Silver Lake, one of those dim-lit restaurants with piano music and perfect risotto. I sat alone, surrounded by couples, and felt entirely complete. No eyes on me, no expectation to smile or sip or entertain. I ordered a glass of wine and toasted myself. To survival, I whispered, and meant it. The next morning, I opened the front door to find an envelope with no postage, no name, just my address in deliberate block letters. Inside was a single-typed sentence: "You don't deserve any of it." I read it twice, then folded it neatly and slid it into a kitchen drawer next to expired coupons. Whoever had written it had wasted paper. I didn't need validation from cowards. I needed coffee, a shower, and 30 uninterrupted minutes to review the portfolio Randolph had left behind. The foundation's transition meeting was still days away, but I wanted to understand the bones of what I was inheriting. Randolph hadn't just built wealth, he built influence, and influence required vigilance. There were spreadsheets, financial reports, and notes scribbled in the margins of annual strategies, all written in that sharp, looping pen I'd once teased him for. He hadn't left instructions, he'd left a blueprint. Reading it felt like unlocking a door I'd been knocking on for years. My phone rang, and I answered before checking the screen. "You smug little parasite," Garrett's voice snarled without greeting. "You think this changes anything? You think that wearing his will like a crown makes you royalty?" I let him shout, because silence unsettled him more than arguments ever did. When he paused for breath, I asked, "Have you finished?" The silence on his end was louder than his rant. "You don't deserve his legacy," he finally said, quieter now. "You manipulated him when he was vulnerable. You're just a glorified secretary with a god complex." "I was never your secretary, Garrett," I said plainly. "And if you'd ever read more than the company's headlines, you'd know I managed operations long before your father retired." He laughed bitterly, but it was hollow. "Keep the keys," he said. "Just remember, doors open both ways." I hung up without saying goodbye. He could keep his metaphors. I had real locks to change and meetings to prepare for. The past was always trying to re-enter like a flood. I'd learned to build sandbags. And if he tried to walk back through any of the doors I now controlled, he'd find more than just locks waiting. By Thursday, Kaya had posted a photo on Instagram. Her, alone on a balcony, cocktail in hand, captioned, "New chapters don't always need old characters." The internet liked her brand of vagueness. I didn't like or comment. I just noted the hotel in the background. Not Malibu, but somewhere cheaper, east of the city. where the wine glasses had seams and the palm trees looked tired. She was already fading into a different tier of relevance. I received another letter the same day, this time with a name, signed in ink, Elaine Eastwood. It was short, handwritten, and almost elegant. You may have won Randolph over, but you never fooled me. When you fall, it won't be money that catches you. It will be the same emptiness you always tried to fill with control. I folded that one too and slipped it beside the first. Elaine had always measured women in threats. Too pretty, too clever, too ambitious. She preferred the harmless kind, the kind who deferred to men and wore beige like a virtue. I had never been beige. I'd been steel wrapped in silk, ambition tucked behind a careful smile, and she'd hated me from the first brunch. But hate couldn't rewrite the will, nor could it erase the meetings I had with Randolph, the ones she'd never been invited to. She had once accused me of poisoning his tea with ideas. I took it as a compliment. If knowledge was venom, I'd built an immunity early. I didn't need her blessing to lead. The board of the foundation met in a clean, modern conference room downtown. They were mostly men, a few women, all older, all polished, all curious. I wore a charcoal suit with no jewelry, hair back, no notes. I wanted to speak from understanding, not rehearsal. Randolph Eastwood was a brilliant man, I began. But even brilliant men can misplace priorities. I'm here to ensure the mission remains louder than his name. No one interrupted, not even the man with the twitchy pen. I laid out the first-year strategy he had sketched: mentorship, scholarships, a tech incubator partnership. Then I added my own proposals: expanding to rural communities, creating mental health initiatives, building a pipeline of leadership instead of just donors. When I finished, they applauded. Not politely, sincerely. Afterward, one of the senior directors pulled me aside. "Randolph never let anyone challenge his models," he said. "But I think he knew you'd do it anyway." I nodded, unsure how to respond. "We're glad you're here," he added, and for the first time in months, I felt the shape of something like belonging. That night, I stood on my balcony with a glass of wine and the city humming below. I didn't think of Garrett or Kaya. I didn't think of Elaine or her careful cursive curses. I thought of the future and how strange it was to inherit one. I had built scaffolding around other people's visions for years. Now the blueprint was mine. I posted a photo, not for revenge, but record. No caption. Just the skyline, the wine, the outline of a woman who had stopped apologizing for surviving. The likes came in slowly, steadily, like ripples. And somewhere on the other side of the city, I knew it would sting. 2 days later, a journalist from a mid-tier business blog reached out requesting a quote. She wanted to write about the unexpected rise of Randolph Eastwood's ex-daughter-in-law as a philanthropic force. I ignored the email, not because I wasn't flattered, but because I wasn't ready to explain myself to people who saw inheritance as luck rather than evidence. I had earned every signature in that codicil through years of labor, foresight, and the kind of loyalty that didn't photograph well. Instead, I spent the weekend reviewing the charity's audit reports and restructuring the outdated vendor contracts. Randolph had good instincts, but he had relied on a few too many yes-men near the end. I removed a supplier that had been overcharging for marketing materials and replaced them with a woman-owned firm in Koreatown. I scheduled a site visit to the youth center in Echo Park, which hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in 4 years. Every decision I made felt like pulling weeds from a garden someone else had forgotten. On Monday, a car was parked in my driveway when I returned from the site visit. Garrett was leaning against it, sunglasses on, holding a manila envelope like it was a prop. I stopped halfway up the walk and raised an eyebrow. "You need to go," I said, keys still in hand. He didn't move. "I'm not here to argue," he said, voice too casual for the tension in his jaw. "I just want to show you something." He held out the envelope and I didn't take it. "It's not a threat," he added quickly. "It's proof." Against my better judgment, I reached for it. The paper inside was grainy, copied, and sloppily stapled. It looked like correspondence, emails between Randolph and a private investigator. My name came up, but not in the way Garrett intended. Randolph had vetted me, yes, but the emails were from 3 years ago, long before our marriage ended, long before he fell ill. You're trying to tell me what, exactly? I asked, folding the pages. That your father did his due diligence before giving me access to his world? Garrett blinked, caught off guard by my calm. You think this proves I manipulated him, but it only proves he wanted certainty. And he got it. He ran a hand through his hair and looked away. He was supposed to trust me, he muttered. I'm his son. His voice cracked, just slightly, and I saw it, the fracture beneath the performance. He always acted like I was never enough. I didn't speak. There was nothing to say to a man who had mistaken inheritance for love. He had never once asked his father what he cared about, only what he owned. Garrett had grown up believing the family name was a ladder rung, not a responsibility, and now, standing on the porch of a woman he once humiliated, he had no ladder left. You should go, I said again, softer now. He nodded, but didn't move. This isn't about the will anymore, he said. It's about what people think when they find out what he gave you. They're going to start asking questions. I narrowed my eyes. Let them. His mouth opened like he wanted to argue, but then he thought better of it. He got back into his car and drove off without another word. I watched until his taillights disappeared, then went inside and shredded the papers. The next morning, I met with the Foundation's education partners to discuss expanding their scholarship program. The director of programming, a woman named Latrice, had been skeptical of me at first. But after 2 hours of reviewing impact reports and budget forecasts, she warmed. You came prepared, she said, as if surprised. I always do, I replied, because I had learned preparation was my sharpest armor. That afternoon, I received a call from Mary Ann Hess. There's a situation, she said plainly. Garrett has filed a formal objection to the codicil. I leaned back in my chair and sighed. Of course he has, I said, more tired than angry. He's claiming mental decline, Mary Ann added, that Randolph wasn't of sound mind when the changes were made. I resisted the urge to laugh. He was sharper than ever, I said. The man beat me in chess 3 times that day. He's pulling in a neurologist from the Eastwood Medical Trust to support the claim, she continued. It may go to court. I closed my laptop. Then we'll go to court, I said. I have no intention of stepping aside. That night, I called my attorney and she reassured me that the documentation was airtight. He can throw a tantrum in litigation form, she said dryly. But he's not going to undo a witnessed, notarized, legally sound codicil just because he feels slighted. I thanked her and hung up, then poured myself a drink I hadn't earned but needed. Outside, the city pulsed with quiet confidence, and for the first time in a long while, so did I. Whatever storm Garrett tried to summon, I was ready for it. The lawsuit was filed 2 weeks later, and news of it spread faster than wildfire in a dry canyon. Most headlines read like whispers disguised as journalism. Heir disputes father's will after assets given to ex-wife. They all got the facts wrong, of course. I wasn't Garrett's ex-wife when Randolph signed the codicil, and the term ex-wife clung to me like a label I'd never asked for. But none of that mattered to readers looking for scandal more than truth. Kaya posted a story on her social media the day the lawsuit broke. It was just a quote. Some people climb ladders, others marry the carpenter. Subtlety had never been her strength. She was trying to paint herself as the wise bystander, though she'd once stapled a spreadsheet upside down and blamed the printer. I didn't respond, not publicly or privately. Instead, I kept working. The board stood behind me unanimously, and not one donor pulled their pledge. In fact, 2 new benefactors reached out with interest, citing the transparency and urgency of the new leadership. We like what you're doing, one wrote. It feels honest for once. Honesty had become its own currency, and I had plenty of it. Still, there were days when fatigue clung to my ribs like wet fabric. The paperwork never ended, and every move I made felt like it was being watched by someone waiting for me to misstep. Garrett had hired a PR consultant to start leaking sound bites. She manipulated a dying man. One quote read, "She turned grief into a transaction." But grief, to me, had never been transactional. It had been a room I lived in, quietly, while the rest of the house carried on. I had mourned Randolph in private, with no press release, no curated tears. He was the only Eastwood who ever asked me about my past, who wanted to understand the girl I was before the woman he met. And I had never pretended to love him more than I did. When my deposition was scheduled, I dressed in navy wool and wore no makeup. I wanted to look like truth, not performance. Garrett arrived 15 minutes late with Kaya in tow, and she wore heels too loud for a courthouse. He didn't meet my eyes as we passed in the hallway. I took that as a small victory. Inside the room, Marianne sat beside me like a pillar. The opposing counsel tried to rattle me with phrasing, benefited from proximity, influenced elder decisions, emotional leverage. But I answered every question calmly, never hesitating, never overstating. Yes, I was close to Randolph, I said once. He trusted me because I earned that trust, not because I borrowed it. Garrett was deposed next, and I wasn't present, but my attorney gave me the rundown. He had contradicted himself twice, once about the timeline, and once about his father's memory. He said Randolph forgot his assistant's name in January, she explained, but then later mentioned Randolph reciting account numbers from memory in February. I raised an eyebrow. That won't help him. No, she agreed, it won't. But she also warned me that courts weren't always about truth. Sometimes they were about the better storyteller. That stuck with me for days. I wasn't interested in spinning narratives, but I knew the power of clarity. So I started writing everything down, not just for court, but for myself. I wrote about the first time Randolph asked me to sit in on a board meeting, about how he noticed when I rewrote a flawed outreach plan in 30 minutes flat, about the time he called me at 10 p.m., panicking over a misfiled grant, and I walked him through the fix without needing notes. These weren't anecdotes for a legal brief. They were reminders that I had been more than background. The trial date was set for late October, and until then, the air hung heavy with speculation. Elaine Eastwood gave a quote to a lifestyle magazine about watching legacy be diluted by ambition. I clipped it, not because I cared, but because it amused me how elegantly she could insult me without naming names. Garrett made an appearance on a podcast no one reputable listened to, spouting vague grievances about fairness and stolen futures. It's not about the money, he said. It's about principle, and I nearly choked on my tea. The truth was, it had always been about the money for him. Even as a teenager, he cared more about the shape of his inheritance than the meaning behind it. Randolph once told me, Garrett loves the sound of ownership, but not the weight. That sentence lived in my head like scripture. Every day I sat at the foundation desk, I felt the weight and chose not to flinch. My staff never asked about the lawsuit. They kept their heads down, their calendars full, and their tone respectful. But I caught them watching me sometimes, curious, cautious, maybe even quietly inspired. I wasn't trying to be an icon. I was just trying to survive with grace. If that looked like leadership, so be it. 3 nights before the court date, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. Can we talk? Just you and me, please. I didn't need to ask who it was. Only Garrett would ask for civility after so much public venom. I stared at the message, unreadable as smoke. Before I narrate what happens next, kindly let me know what city or country you're watching from and why you haven't subscribed yet. I didn't respond to Garrett's message right away. Instead, I set my phone down and finished brushing my teeth, staring at the reflection of a woman who no longer jumped when ghost knocked. Silence had become my sharpest tool, sharper than sarcasm, heavier than rage. By the time I slid under the covers, the screen lit again with another ping. Tomorrow, Griffith Park, by the fountain at noon. I rolled over and let it dim without replying. The next day, though, I found myself driving toward Griffith Park anyway. Curiosity wasn't weakness, it was reconnaissance. If he wanted to stage a performance, I needed to know his script before court. The fountain was quiet at noon. Families scattered with picnic baskets and joggers circling like clockwork. Garrett stood alone, sunglasses hooked on his collar, looking less like a victor and more like a man waiting for a bus. "You came," he said when he saw me. His voice was softer, like he had rehearsed it in front of a mirror. I didn't sit. I stood opposite him, arms crossed, letting the distance between us become its own language. "Say what you need to," I told him. He exhaled, shoulders sagging. "You've already won," he said, and I almost laughed at how quickly he contradicted his own lawsuits. The foundation, the houses, the board, all of it. I don't know who I am without the Eastwood name meaning something. He glanced at the water rippling under the sun. I thought maybe you'd understand that. I tilted my head. Understand, yes. Forgive, no. His mouth tightened, but he didn't interrupt. You spent years treating me like furniture you couldn't sell but didn't want to throw out. You never once asked what I wanted, only what I could carry for you. And now you're shocked I'm still standing when you've collapsed under your own shadow. He rubbed his temples like he wanted to scrub away my words. I'm not asking for pity. I'm asking for mercy. The word hung in the air like smoke. If you step aside, if you let me have even half of what he left, I'll drop everything. No more lawsuits. No more press. He looked up at me with desperation that nearly masked his arrogance. I didn't soften. You think mercy is a transaction, I said. But mercy doesn't erase consequences. Your father trusted me because I listened when you didn't. He gave me the weight because you only wanted the shine. I turned to leave before his excuses could follow. Wait, he said, voice breaking slightly. Kaya left. I stopped, back still turned. She packed up last week. Said she didn't sign up for a courtroom soap opera. I don't even blame her. His words carried the emptiness of a man who had built his identity on applause and now heard only silence. I faced him then, just briefly. You'll survive this, Garrett. You'll survive it by learning that not everything collapses without you. Sometimes things grow stronger once you're gone. He blinked at me, stunned by the bluntness. Goodbye, I added, and walked away, not once looking back. That night, my attorney called to confirm the trial was still set. He hasn't withdrawn anything, she said. Whatever he said to you, it was only talk. I told her I wasn't surprised. Words were his currency, and they always devalued on delivery. But my resolve was steel by then. I would not waver. The courtroom on Monday buzzed with cameras and whispers. Elaine sat in the gallery, pearls sharp against her neck, her eyes like daggers thrown without movement. Garrett sat at the plaintiff's table, jaw clenched, a man rehearsing dignity he didn't own. I sat across from him, hands folded, face calm. Marianne whispered, "Breathe," though I already was. Opening arguments blurred together, legal jargon dressed as theater. Garrett's attorney painted me as opportunistic, a woman who had hovered too close to power and caught the spoils when the man who held it slipped. Marianne countered with documents, timelines, witness statements. This was not whim, she said firmly. This was deliberate planning by a man of sound mind. The judge nodded once, a small crack in the marble mask. When it was my turn to testify, I spoke clearly. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. Randolph asked me to witness the codicil because he wanted me there, I said. He trusted my judgment because I had proven it for years, both in business and in stewardship. I gained nothing he didn't choose to give. Garrett stared at me while I spoke, eyes burning, as though glaring hard enough might carve cracks in me. But when the cross-examination began, his attorney's questions collapsed under their own contradictions. If he was declining, I said once, why did he beat me in chess 3 times the day he signed? The gallery chuckled softly, and even the judge allowed the corner of his mouth to lift. Garrett's attorney stammered, shuffled his papers, and moved on. By the end of the week, closing statements felt unnecessary. The evidence had already drawn its own verdict. Garrett slouched at his table, energy drained, the performance stripped away. Elaine whispered something to him, but he didn't react. I sat straighter, breathing evenly, waiting for the gavel. The judge ruled the codicil valid, Randolph's intentions unambiguous. Garrett's objection was dismissed with prejudice, meaning he couldn't drag it back again. Marianne squeezed my hand once beneath the table, a rare gesture of celebration. I didn't look at Garrett as I stood. Some victories were best observed in silence. The courthouse steps were a canyon of flashing cameras and shouts. Reporters angled microphones like spears, hungry for a soundbite that could be twisted into scandal. I walked through them without pausing, head high, hands steady, silence my only shield. Behind me, Garrett muttered curses under his breath, but none of them carried past the swarm. The difference between us was stark. I had nothing to prove, and he had nothing left. That evening, I returned to the Brentwood estate for the first time since the ruling. The house was quieter than I remembered, emptier too, as though even Randolph's ghost had chosen peace now that the verdict was sealed. I walked the halls slowly, fingertips brushing wood and marble, reacquainting myself with a space that no longer felt borrowed. In the study, Randolph's chair faced the window, exactly where he'd left it. I sat there, closing my eyes, letting the silence affirm what the gavel had already declared. The next morning, Elaine arrived unannounced. She stood at the doorway in a cream suit, pearls sharp as ever, her posture still carved from disapproval. "Congratulations," she said flatly, though it landed like an insult. I offered her coffee, which she declined with a sniff. "You think you've won something permanent, but everything in this world is temporary," she added, eyes scanning the house as though it might crumble on cue. "I didn't win," I said calmly. "I was chosen." That stopped her for half a beat. She pursed her lips, unwilling to admit the truth in it, and shifted tactics. "Garrett may be reckless, but he is still my son. When he rebuilds, when he takes what's left, don't think for a moment you'll be untouchable." I let her words fall to the floor like dust. After she left, I returned to the foundation office downtown. The staff greeted me warmly, their congratulations unspoken but understood in every nod and smile. Work felt more urgent now, heavier with expectation, but I welcomed it. There were programs to fund, partnerships to lock in, futures to anchor in place. Unlike Garrett, I wasn't afraid of responsibility. I thrived on it. 2 weeks passed before his name surfaced again. A tabloid ran photos of him leaving a Sunset Boulevard club, collar open, eyes glassy, with no one on his arm. The headline screamed, "Disgraced Air Spirals After Will Loss." It should have satisfied me, but it didn't. Pity was a flavor I had no appetite for, even when it belonged to him. Meanwhile, Kaya resurfaced in whispers. A new job in marketing at a startup that wouldn't last the year, already posting curated optimism. She had shed Garrett like a snakeskin, pretending the beach parades and courtroom appearances had never existed. I found myself oddly relieved for her. She had played her role, been discarded, and escaped before the collapse turned permanent. Some lessons were best learned early. At the foundation, my work grew into rhythm. I met with school principals, youth coordinators, and parents who told stories that carved humility into my bones. A boy in Echo Park showed me the robotics kit the Grant had bought him, his grin wide enough to undo months of fatigue. A mother cried when she learned her daughter had been accepted into the new scholarship program. These were the dividends Randolph had imagined, though I had refined the blueprint. They mattered more than mansions or stocks ever could. One Friday night, Marianne invited me to dinner at her home. It was a quiet affair. Wine, roasted chicken, a backyard lit with string lights. "You've handled yourself with grace," she said, pouring me another glass. "But don't mistake a closed case for a closed chapter." I understood what she meant. Garrett wasn't finished trying to haunt me. And sure enough, the next morning another letter appeared at my door. This one was scrawled, messy, and unsigned, though the tone reeked of Garrett. "You don't get to erase me. You don't get to rewrite history like you were the only one who mattered." I folded it as I had the others and tucked it in the drawer. Words couldn't topple me anymore. Still, I increased security at the estate. New locks, cameras, a guard who rotated shifts discreetly. It wasn't fear that drove me, but foresight. Garrett was a man cornered, and cornered men often confuse desperation for strategy. I wasn't about to leave anything vulnerable. By late winter, his name had faded from headlines. People moved on, as they always did, hungry for fresher scandals and shinier downfalls. But I hadn't forgotten him, not entirely. I saw him sometimes in the lines of the city, the empty tables at bars, the crumbling billboards of old tech firms. He was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost of squandered privilege. One evening, driving home from the office, I spotted him by accident. He was on a street corner in West Hollywood, thinner, shoulders stooped, arguing with someone over cash. The sight startled me, not because I felt fear, but because it was the first time he had looked truly human. He caught my eye across the traffic, and for a moment, recognition sparked. Then, the light changed, and I drove on. That night, I opened my journal and wrote a single line. "Survival is not revenge, but it is enough." Then I closed the book, placed it on the nightstand, and turned out the light. Garrett could chase shadows all he wanted. I had built something that lived in daylight, and daylight had no interest in ruins. Spring arrived with soft rains and streets blooming in purple jacaranda. At the foundation, our scholarship recipients were preparing for their first semester at universities across the state, and every acceptance letter felt like a quiet vindication. I kept my head down, working, but the city had a way of reminding me that Garrett's ghost still lingered. His name would pop up on gossip blogs, usually in connection with late-night altercations or unpaid bills. He was becoming a cautionary tale, though I doubted he realized it. One morning, Marianne called me into her office. "He's petitioned again," she said, sliding a folder across her desk. "This time, not against the codicil, but against you personally. He's claiming mismanagement of the foundation's funds." I blinked, then opened the folder. The accusations were thin, built on conjecture and bad math, but still capable of bruising reputations. "He has no evidence," I said, closing the folder. Marianne nodded. "True, but mud sticks, even when it's flung by desperate hands. We'll file a counter, but I need you to prepare for more public scrutiny." I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. He's trying to break me with noise, not facts. That week, I held a press conference, the first since inheriting the foundation. Cameras lined the back wall, pens poised like daggers, but I kept my tone calm. "The Eastwood Foundation operates with full transparency," I said. "Every cent is audited, every contract vetted. I welcome any third-party review because truth has nothing to fear from inspection." The reporters scribbled, and for once, I felt no tremor in my voice. Afterward, a young journalist approached me privately. "You don't seem angry," she said curiously. "Most people would lash out." I smiled faintly. "Anger is easy. Accountability is harder." She nodded, and I could tell she respected the difference. Later that night, the article she wrote carried the headline, "Inheritance with Integrity." Still, Garrett didn't stop. Letters continued, arriving at my door, some typed, some scrawled, always unsigned, but dripping with his cadence. "You'll choke on the empire you stole. Your victories will sour in your mouth. Even ghosts can testify." Each time, I folded them neatly and placed them in the drawer, now thick with his futile attempts at intimidation. Paper had weight, but not the kind he wanted. By early summer, whispers began that Garrett had burned through most of his remaining trust. Clubs stopped extending tabs, hotels stopped offering suites, and friends stopped answering calls. The man who once flaunted wealth at Malibu Beach now looked like a regular sunburned tourist. It should have been satisfying, but instead it left a strange, hollow space in me. Watching someone implode wasn't triumph. It was erosion. One afternoon, I was walking out of a meeting when I saw him again. He was sitting on the curb outside the foundation building, hair unkempt, shirt untucked, a bottle of water clutched like treasure. "We need to talk," he said, voice cracked from sun and exhaustion. Security moved toward him, but I lifted a hand and told them to hold. For reasons I couldn't name, I sat down beside him. "You look terrible," I said, not unkindly. He gave a dry laugh. "Guess I lost the Beachbody sponsorship." For a moment, we sat in silence, the city rushing by us like we were statues. Then he whispered, "I don't know how to stop losing." The words fell out of him like confession. I studied his face, searching for the arrogance I used to despise, but it wasn't there. Just fatigue, regret, maybe even a flicker of something human I hadn't seen in years. "Then stop playing games you can't win," I said softly. He looked at me, eyes rimmed red, and nodded once. It wasn't acceptance. It was acknowledgement. He stood slowly, thanked me in a voice so faint I almost missed it, and walked away without asking for money or favors. I didn't follow. Some redemptions had to be chosen, not handed out. I went back inside and returned to my desk, the drawer of letters waiting like evidence of a war already fading. My work mattered more than his ghosts. Later that week, Elaine sent me another note, this one hand-delivered in an envelope heavy with perfume. "You may hold the reins, but don't think for a moment you've tamed the horse." I placed it with the others, though hers smelled stronger, sharper. For all her venom, she had grown quieter since the ruling. Perhaps even she was realizing that legacy belonged to those willing to carry it, not just claim it. At the scholarship ceremony in July, the students took the stage one by one to thank donors, mentors, and families. Their voices cracked with hope, their futures bright as the spotlights above. I watched from the front row, applauding each, a steady anchor in a sea of beginnings. When the last student spoke, I felt something loosen in my chest. This was the inheritance worth fighting for. Not mansions, not grudges, but possibility. When the ceremony ended, I walked out into the evening air, the sky streaked gold and violet. For the first time in a long while, I didn't look over my shoulder for Garrett's shadow. Maybe he was gone. Maybe he was rebuilding. Maybe he was still unraveling. Whatever the case, his story was no longer mine to carry. Mine was just beginning, written in the laughter of students who owed me nothing but hope. Autumn arrived with sharper winds, and the foundation prepared for its annual gala. I walked through the venue early that morning, watching staff hang lights and test microphones, the hum of anticipation filling the air. This wasn't just an event. It was proof that we had weathered storms and still stood tall. Donors had doubled, partnerships had expanded, and our programs now stretched into communities we had once overlooked. It felt like momentum, not survival. Still, I couldn't ignore the possibility that Garrett might appear. His name hadn't crossed headlines in months, but silence often meant planning. I asked security to keep an eye out, not because I feared him, but because the night wasn't about him. It was about the students, the families, and the work that outlived egos. If he showed up, I wanted him to see that clearly. The gala unfolded with elegance, candlelit tables and speeches that drew both tears and laughter. Students shared their journeys, parents thanked the foundation, and the applause rang like waves against the shore. I sat at the head table, listening, applauding, humbled. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. This foundation is not built on inheritance, I said. It is built on accountability, trust, and the futures we shape together. The room erupted in applause, and for the first time in years, I felt weightless. Randolph's presence lingered like a steady hand on my shoulder, reminding me that this was what he had intended. Garrett's absence was almost a blessing. No disruption, no shadow. The night belonged to hope, and hope had no rival. I went home that evening with tired feet but a heart steady as stone. The next morning, I found a letter slipped under my door, different from the others. This one was written carefully. No scrawls, no rage, no perfume. It began simply, "I won't fight anymore." My breath caught as I read the rest. "I don't know where I'm going, but I know I can't keep circling you. Take care of what he left." I was never meant to. There was no signature, but I didn't need one. For the first time, his words didn't sound like weapons. They sounded like surrender. I folded the letter and placed it on top of the drawer pile, though I knew I wouldn't add another after it. The drawer was a chapter, and chapters end. Weeks passed, and the city grew colder, its palm trees swaying against gray skies. Work consumed me, but in the quiet moments, I thought about Garrett, not with anger, not even with pity, but with distance. He had been a part of my story, but no longer the author of it. Our intersection had ended, and what remained was mine to build. That clarity was more freeing than any court victory. Elaine never wrote again. Perhaps she had tired of sending barbed letters that landed nowhere. Or perhaps she saw what I did, that the foundation thrived not in spite of me, but because of me. She faded back into her society circles, where pearls and whispers still carried weight. I no longer needed her validation or her venom. At the office, my staff began to treat me not as an outsider who had inherited power, but as a leader who had earned it. Their respect wasn't immediate, but respect built slowly often ran deepest. We worked late nights, balanced budgets, and shared small victories. A successful fundraiser, a student excelling, a program expanding. These were the bricks of legacy, sturdier than wealth. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just holding something, but shaping it. On a Saturday in November, I drove back to Malibu Beach, the same place where Garrett had once flaunted Kaya, as if my humiliation were sport. The sand felt the same, but I did not. I sat with a coffee, watching the waves curl and collapse, and realized the beach no longer remembered me as broken. It remembered me as rebuilt. Families laughed nearby, children chased gulls, and couples strolled arm in arm. Life didn't pause for betrayal or revenge. It continued, weaving new stories across old places. I smiled to myself, quietly, the wind brushing against me like an old friend. For once, the laughter around me didn't sting. It simply lived beside mine. When I left the beach, I didn't look back. Some places serve their purpose and then release you. Malibu had been a stage for humiliation, then for reckoning, and finally, for closure. Now it was just sand and water. Nothing more, nothing less. The Foundation's year closed with record donations and plans for expansion. New staff were hired, new programs drafted, new communities reached. I looked at the year-end report one evening and felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. Not triumph, not survival, just peace. It was an unfamiliar feeling, but it fit. As winter deepened, I realized the story had shifted entirely. I was no longer the woman defined by divorce, betrayal, or even inheritance. I was defined by what I built and who I became after. Garrett's ruin had been loud, but my rise had been steady. And steady always outlasts spectacle. The new year dawned with pale skies and the promise of fresh work. At the Foundation, we launched a mentorship program pairing professionals with students, and the response was overwhelming. I sat in the conference room, watching teenagers shake hands with architects, engineers, and writers, their faces glowing with possibility. This was the blueprint becoming real, brick by brick, life by life. Randolph would have been proud, and for the first time I felt I was not carrying his weight, but extending his vision. In February, I received a postcard with no return address. It was from a small coastal town up north, the kind with cliffs and quiet streets. The handwriting was unmistakably Garrett's. "I'm working now. It's not much, but it's mine. Don't worry, I won't bother you again." I placed it in the drawer, not with the angry letters, but in a separate space, a coda instead of a curse. Life grew simpler after that. Elaine stopped haunting me with her pearls and paper, and Kaya disappeared entirely into a life I had no reason to follow. The silence was strange at first, like a city after rain, but soon it became a comfort. I realized I no longer checked headlines for Garrett's name or waited for footsteps that never came. My life had narrowed, and in narrowing, it had become sharper. The estate in Brentwood became less of a museum and more of a home. I filled it with books, not trophies, plants, not paintings, laughter from board members and students, not empty echoes. The study, once Randolph's stronghold, became my workspace, cluttered but alive. I stopped walking the halls like a guest and started walking them like a custodian of something alive. Legacy wasn't marble or stock, it was motion, and I was in constant motion. One evening in March, the Foundation hosted a dinner for its newest scholarship recipients. Their families filled the hall, voices overlapping like music, stories spilling like wine. I raised a glass when dessert was served and kept my word short. "What we build together is stronger than what we inherit," I said. "And tonight, you've proven that." The applause that followed was warm, not performative. After the dinner, a young girl approached me. She was maybe 16, with braids and a nervous smile. "Thank you," she said, "not just for the scholarship, for proving that women can lead without apology." Her words caught me off guard, but I carried them home like a torch. They were heavier than pearls, steadier than diamonds. By summer, the Foundation had expanded into 2 new neighborhoods, and our name was no longer a footnote to the Eastwoods but a headline of its own. Invitations arrived daily, panels, interviews, conferences, and I accepted only what mattered. I had no need to prove myself to crowds hungry for gossip. My proof was in the classrooms, the libraries, the lives altered by opportunity. Garrett's empire had collapsed into dust, but mine had risen on foundations of trust, and trust was not easily undone. I returned to Malibu only once more, near the anniversary of that humiliating day on the sand. The beach was busy with children, tourists, and surfers, none of whom knew the ghosts buried there. I walked past the cafe where I'd once sat with coffee, the memory sharp and not wounding. Time had dulled it into something almost abstract, a story that belonged to someone else. I left without lingering, content to let the tide erase the last trace of it. The drawer of letters remained in my house, untouched but not forgotten. Sometimes I thought of burning them, but I decided against it. They weren't curses anymore. They were fossils, proof of battles survived. Every folded page was a reminder that words could wound but not define. I kept them because survival deserves its record. In late autumn, Mary Ann retired, passing the mantle to a younger attorney she had trained. At her farewell dinner, she hugged me tightly. "You've carried yourself with dignity," she whispered. "Don't ever forget that's rarer than victory." I promised I wouldn't. Her faith in me felt like another kind of inheritance, one I was proud to accept. That winter, as the city glittered with holiday lights, I finally allowed myself to rest. I read novels by the fire, hosted friends in the dining room, and let laughter echo off walls that had once held only arguments. The Brentwood estate was no longer Randolph's house or Garrett's imagined kingdom. It was mine, alive with new stories. The woman who had once been flaunted against was now the one who set the table. On New Year's Eve, I stood on the balcony with a glass of champagne, the city alive below. I thought of Garrett, somewhere far north, perhaps watching his own sky in silence. I thought of Kaya, chasing relevance in another circle. I thought of Elaine, pearls dimmed by time. And then I let them all drift away, like smoke carried off by the wind. The clock struck midnight, and fireworks bloomed across the horizon. I raised my glass not to revenge, not to ruin, but to resilience. To the students whose lives were only beginning, to the foundation that stood stronger than scandal, and to the woman I had become, no longer surviving, but living. The past had flaunted its cruelty on a Malibu beach, but the future was mine. Garrett's downfall had been written in his father's will, but my rise had been written in my own hand. That was the truest inheritance of all, not wealth, not recognition, but authorship. I had claimed the pen from the ruins of his performance, and I had written myself free. Thank you for listening to Evelyn's story. If you're yet to subscribe, please consider doing so before watching another story on the channel.